Life Christian Television presents a special presentation on mental health through a biblical view. Pathway to Healing and Wholeness with your host, Lisa Eady.
Hi, and welcome to Healing and Wholeness. I'm your host, Lisa Eady, Christian counselor and author of The 7 Principles of Healing Trauma. And we have a treat for you this morning. We have a co-host, Miss Maya Thomason, here with us to talk about grief and how that affects our lives, what we grieve, how we grieve, and how to best process grief in our lives. So welcome. It's glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
So I know that in the last year you've went through some grief, but you've also had grief throughout your life, as all of us had. We grieve different things. And so I kind of want to just start by talking about what is grief. And for most of us, we define grief as just this deep, intense emotional suffering that is caused by a significant loss in our life. And we know the loss of a loved one causes grief, and I think that's what we think about most often when we're talking about grief is the loss of a loved one. But we grieve a loss of any type. So what are some other things you think that people grieve?
Well, I think something I have seen in my life is that people grieve their own expectations for life. So, like, your own righteousness can lead you to unnecessary grief as well. That's why it says, seek first the kingdom of God so all righteousness can be handed to you, because God's will is going to be done on the earth. And when we put our own righteousness in front of God's, then we're creating an atmosphere for grief, unnecessary grief. And then also just grieving parents that you didn't have, or a child born different than you thought they should have been born, or a sibling, or addiction in families. Like every family, we talked about this earlier, every family that has an addict in their family grieves the life that they thought that they were going to have. Or even sometimes in sacrificing and leading yourself to the Lord, you have to let things fall off, and that can be grieving as well, your old life, even sin.
Absolutely. The significance of any loss is what we grieve. And that can be anything from losing a pet, losing a job, losing a home. Even if it was your choice, maybe you've been called to move for your job, or maybe you're transitioning out of college or transitioning out of high school or going into retirement. Maybe I think the big thing that Maya said was the expectation of what we thought life would be like. And so we grieve all these things that we've lost, even good things. Missionaries that go on the field grieve their old life, what it was like. It's just that sense of sorrow. But then there are deep levels of grief and grieving. Grief is kind of how you feel, but then the grieving is actually the process of that. And I think in the church, we're told to tough it out. We're told to, you should already be done with this grieving by now. Yeah. And when people don't grieve appropriately, it comes back later as a trigger, and it causes a lot of emotional wounds. And so I think grief is like a roller coaster. It has ups and downs. It comes in like waves sometimes. Like you'll be fine. You're standing at the supermarket checking out, and something reminds you of that loss, and it just comes over you like a wave. Yeah. And so understanding that feeling of grief comes like a wave, and trusting, knowing that as it come in like a wave, it will get better. It will go back out. And understanding that it is completely normal to have these roller coaster feelings when you're grieving. With your experience in grieving, talk about that just a moment, about the roller coaster of how you it's up and down.
Definitely. I think the hardest part is accepting that something has happened or that you've experienced a loss. But I've had hair fall out. I've almost gone bald in grief. But in my own experiences, I have grieved well and I have not grieved well times. And it all boiled down to, was I allowing myself to have those ugly emotions? And was I okay with that for that season? Or was I pushing them aside in hopes to look put together for the time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very important, because I do believe in Christians as a whole, we kind of dress up to show we're not messed up.
Yeah.
Like we put on this
That's
preacher
good.
face of, oh, everything's okay. And you walk in among Christian friends
Yeah.
and how are you? Oh, blessed and highly favored. And we have this
God is good.
turmoil, yes, going on within us, like a war within our emotions.
Yeah.
And I remember as ministers of the gospel, my husband going to church the day after his mom died. Totally should not have been there. I
No.
mean, he should have been home crying, processing the grief,
Yeah.
doing what he needed to do, but felt this need to go to church.
Yeah, and perform.
And to perform, and that's what he was doing.
Performing.
But then that wave of grief hit when someone said something to him, and I mean, it was devastating.
Yeah.
And so then he had to go and grieve properly. And I think we're all pretty well accommodated with the 5 stages of grief, the denial of this can't be happening to me, where we just think this didn't happen.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, that's not real. What?
exactly. I mean, we try to push it to the back of our mind and we have to really, that's why we do memorial services. That's why we do things to bring the finality of it.
Yes.
Because now we are learning how to do life without whatever the loss was in our life.
Yes. And I feel like when you lose people who are close, it doesn't just change your heart, but it changes your daily routine. And that messes your mind up completely. Like, my stepbrother passed recently. And I mean, I had not talked to him in a while. We didn't have the greatest relationship, but my whole world felt different. Like, it changes everything. So now you're also grieving, but you're getting used to a new routine. And for relationships that are even closer, like a spouse or someone you live with every single day, like, it can be very difficult.
Yeah, because it changes our identity. So if we've been known as a mother or father, sister, brother,
Yeah.
mom, dad, and now we're learning to do life without that person in our life, but we're no longer the sister.
Yeah.
And so where do we fit in this new reality that we're in? Because now we're in a new reality without that person. Not that we won't always be a parent if we've lost, a child, but it does change our daily routine and what's going on and having to find a new normal. And so after denial, usually, we have the big anger. The ugly anger that comes, we're mad at
Yeah.
human nature all the way from Adam is, Adam, where are you? Oh, well, the woman made me do it. And then Eve, oh, the serpent made me do it. So we always, in injustice, when we feel like something is unjust, we want to look for somebody to blame. And that's where the anger comes in. And it can be, to me, when we deal with emotions while we're grieving, it's like the volume's turned up.
Yeah.
Nothing is normal. Like your hairbrush, is kind of getting stuck, and all of a sudden it's like a huge deal because the volume is turned up on our normal emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like in the grieving process, most people get stuck here because they don't want to allow themselves to be angry.
Yeah.
Like, if they would allow themselves to be angry and let it pass, it would pass so much faster than fighting it
Yeah.
and exhausting yourself.
Because good Christians don't get angry.
Yeah, we can't have anger. Like, God didn't have wrath. Like,
Exactly. That's the stigma of part of you need to just get over it. But when I think about grief in the Bible, Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus and he knows I'm going to resurrect him.
yeah.
But the fact that it takes us through that passage that he went and he wept with Mary and Martha, that it was important enough, that they were important enough, that he took that time and they're in this grieving process, that there's a story in the Bible about it, that he would go and weep with them, because that is part of our human nature, that it's sad, and even we see a little bit of anger in that story where they said, well, if you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. And I think with Christians, a lot of times people look to God and like, where were you in this? Because we don't understand that death is not punishment. For a believer, it's graduation day.
Yeah, it's freedom. And I always tell people, and I say this with all the love in my heart, but sometimes when you have a child that's acting a fool in public, as a parent, they're having a temper tantrum on the floor. Sometimes you can like make it through and it's their best interest for you to keep going, but sometimes it's their best interest for you to take them home. So it's also a mercy thing. Like God uses taking his children home as a preventative sometimes from stopping them from living a whole life without him, Mm-hmm. So sometimes the Lord will see the path that you're going on, and not saying that God's going to strike you because you sinned. Please don't hear that. But I'm saying a lot of times God handles it like a parent. We see death as final when we're not in communion with Christ. Christ sees death as a reward.
Yeah.
So it's different. So he's like, okay, like Susan is having a meltdown to like, she's going to go, this is going to go south. Maybe we should take her home where she has peace and love. And you know what I mean? Like,
and ultimate healing.
Yeah.
No pain. And I think, when we go through the anger and the Bible says be angry and sin not. So we know anger is part of that, and finding healthy ways to process the anger so we don't get stuck, and also dealing with the trauma of a loss, because sometimes we're grieving, but then sometimes there's trauma associated. We're traumatized during that loss if it was something traumatic that happened in that loss. I saw my friend who lost her daughter really struggle after the death of her daughter. And it was because it was so traumatic. She was traumatized in that moment. It was just so unexpected, which death is always unexpected. You're never, even if you're sitting with someone and maybe they've been sick a long time, it is hard for our human brain to process the death before it happens, to really be prepared. You think you're prepared, but you're not prepared yet. And so I think allowing yourself to be real, to be honest, to be vulnerable, not just with yourself, but those around you, with your pastor, of saying, this is where I'm at in this moment, and be okay with not being okay.
Yes, and I think that really comes from having a tight relationship with Christ. Because if you're not close to Christ, then you won't feel comfortable and vulnerable enough with him so that you can move on to phase 3 and move on in your grieving process. If you don't know him and you're not constantly communing, like you can't just jump into a deep relationship with Christ, it's so important to prepare for situations like this by daily communing.
Absolutely, because it says he's near to the brokenhearted. So when we're grieving, we know that Christ is near to us. And it's a perfect opportunity to just lean in and hand him the burden and really trust him to get us through it. But when we read, I think about the Psalms, and I think about David and how a lot of that is grief.
Yeah.
When David is writing some of the Psalms, I mean, they're very sorrowful, they're very dark. He is grieving the loss of many things, the loss of friends, the loss of even his son turning against him, and all these things. And he's writing these Psalms, and he's very vulnerable with God about, this is where I'm at, this is how I feel in this moment. And then he always encourages himself back, but I know you are there.
Yeah.
And when we don't process the grief, when we don't feel the feelings, because to really process grief, you have to sit with the feelings. You have to feel them, to heal them. You have to find productive ways to get through the anger, productive ways to get through the denial. And we even see this in the Psalms, when the bargaining starts of, oh God, well, I'll do this if you'll do this. And we get in this mindset that is more about ourselves than about the will of the Father, because we only see in part and prophesy in part. And so there's such a bigger picture that a lot of times we don't understand.
That's so good. And it also reminds me of Mary and Martha, when Mary's at the feet of Jesus and Martha's in the kitchen, right? Like, she's angry. She hit rage. First, it was denial. Like, I'm grieving my time with the Lord. And so she's trying to make up reasons why she needs to be somewhere else. And then she becomes angry with Martha. Like, we see the same pattern in her grieving time. And I would really encourage you, if you're grieving time today, like time lost, well, I wish I would have been with the Lord sooner. I wish I would have been more devoted to him in my youth. You have time today. I don't know what your tomorrow looks like, and you don't either, but you can start today. Like, if Martha, instead of having her anger, what if she would have taken that frustration and sat with Mary instead?
Yeah, that's huge, because he says he'll restore the years the locust ate.
Yeah, that's right.
And so when we look at his timing, his will, and get the focus off of ourselves, and learn to not run from the feelings, not hide, not mask, not put on a mask that we're okay. Because a lot of times depression comes and we know, I'm too sad to do anything kind of depression. Depression is very self-focused.
Yeah, it is.
When we turn to the Lord, and the joy of the Lord is our strength, and when we turn to the Lord and focus on him, you can't worship and be depressed at the same time. Not at the same moment. Now, you may be sad again after your worship, but when we turn our attention to the Lord and we really trust him to be vulnerable and just say, God, this is how I feel in this moment. Like, I feel broken. I feel like part of me is lost since I lost this. I feel like a different person, and all those are okay. And then finally, I think you see David in the Psalms where he comes to a place of acceptance.
Yes.
And that is the last stage of grief. We have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then we get to acceptance, of accepting our new reality. Not that we have to accept anything below what God has for us, but just accepting that now we're doing life without this loss.
Yes.
And what I know that you have grieved, we talked in the car about you had grieved the loss of your mom.
Yes.
That was still alive. But you finally had to come to a place where you could accept it so you could move forward and walk in the abundance God has for you. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So I've shared a couple other times. That my mother was in active addiction. Well, I had to grieve the relationship I wanted with a family unit, like a mom to call when I have a bad day, a dad to comfort me, you know what I mean? Like this beautiful family unit I had seen in so many other places. And also I understood love and affection from a parent because I had a relationship with Christ, but I didn't with my biological mother. And I really had to forgive myself for putting expectations on somebody that they're not achieving, because that's not our role. But I also had to forgive her for her sin and her walk, and then walk through the stages of forgiveness as if she was not alive. It was the same feeling. I mean, I haven't seen her since I was 16 years old. So it's much like mourning someone who hasn't passed yet.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about grief, and especially within a church setting, when pastors are doing pastoral counsel with their members, and if you're grieving, I encourage people to reach out to their pastor, reach out to a Christian therapist or counselor, and really begin to process and walk through, because this is a journey. Grief is a journey, to walk through the journey of grief so you don't get stuck, so you can live the abundant life Jesus promised us. And with that, when I think about grief, I think about a lot of people that go through divorce. That causes a deep level of grief.
Think about that.
Because you've lost what you thought your life would be like. You've lost your daily normality of your unit, that lived, and even what you thought it would be like for your children. Or when you go through a great financial loss and now your life looks different. The loss of health causes grief when people are coming to terms with either a chronic illness or a terminal illness. Just the loss of things that they used to could do, and learning how to live in a new normal. Maybe they were paralyzed, or maybe they have autoimmune issues or cancer, and now they live a new normal. And learning to navigate life that looks different than the picture in your head looked.
Yes. Like when I found out that I needed a hearing aid on my left side, I went through the first two very quickly. I feel like I even skipped the first one. I just went to anger, and I was upset, and then I would be happy one day, upset the next, because I knew as soon as I put it on, which I haven't like bought my hearing aid yet, but I know as soon as I put it on that life from that point on is different in public.
Yeah, it looks different for you. And
Yeah.
so as we come to accepting that God has us, regardless of where we're at the moment, that
Yeah.
He's still, that the scripture says He is near the brokenhearted, that He pulls us in. I think people don't understand that there are physical ramifications to grief, like that you can lose sleep, you can become depressed. There are many things that happen in our physical and emotional self as we're grieving. And there are some tips, that we can use to help us process grief. Taking great physical care of yourself is huge. Eat well, try to sleep well, exercise, get quiet time with the Lord. And I think when we're talking about the grief of a loss, the grief of someone, talk about them. You have to talk about it, because most time we think, oh, if we don't talk about it, if we don't think about it, we can put it out of our mind. But that's not true. It makes it worse. And so talk about that loved one.
Yes, that's
And
really good.
Talk about the things that were good with them, not just, don't mark their life by the last moment, but really memorialize the good times with that person you lost. And even as you talk about it, the more you talk about it, the less angry you get. The more you talk about it and share, it helps you process that. That's just how our brain processes. But also, maybe you didn't get a chance to say goodbye. Maybe there were things left unsaid. And even if you're grieving the loss of someone who's still alive, an estranged parent or a child, write a letter. This really, really helps process. So with a death of a loved one or grieving a loved one that's not there, there are things that are just bottled up inside of us that we needed to say, that we needed to get out.
Yeah.
And I encourage people, put pen to paper and really get those feelings out. This isn't a letter you're going to send. It's not like that. It is.
You can burn it.
You can burn it. You can put it on a balloon. You can,
Yeah.
you can give it to someone you trust, like your counselor, your pastor, but really getting those feelings out. That's the thing. It's like, get it out. Don't let the junk stay in. And so writing a letter can help, just taking really good physical and emotional care for yourself, really leaning into the Lord. Matthew 5:4 said, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted.
That's so good.
And that's a promise we have, that when we lean in to Jesus during possibly the worst times of our life,
Yeah.
that we can be blessed even in that moment.
That's so good. Something else I've done, it's very similar to the letter method. I will make videos on my good days. And I've been doing this since I was in therapy when I was 17. And I make videos on my good days talking about all the joyful things of life and how grateful I am that I survived this, that, and another. And then on those days where I'm ready to like blow up everything and I feel terrible, I'll go back and listen to it. And like, you're going to believe yourself. That's all I'll say. Like,
Absolutely. Thankfulness, neuroscience shows that it actually promotes new neural pathways around the trauma.
yeah.
And so it makes new, those roadways in our brain around the trauma, around what happened. So when we practice the art of thankfulness, and we've talked about that a lot here on Pathway of Healing and Wholeness, on how thankfulness changes the landscape of our brain. And so even in those tough moments, Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up our wounds. So when we're thankful, even when we're brokenhearted, Jesus is doing what He does. There's a myth about grieving that says the pain will go away if I ignore it. But actually trying to keep that pain bottled up only makes it worse, because when we run from healing, you still just have to go back. You have to process the emotion. Yeah. And if you try to run from it, instead of processing, instead of writing the letter, I tell people, sit a chair. Or set a counselor. We do this in counseling. And I'm like, if they were here, they're not, use me as a surrogate,
Yeah.
what did you need to say? Like, what was it? Was it, I wish we could have been closer? Whatever you needed to say, you need to say those things. Not that we're talking to the person that passed. Please hear me clearly on that. We are processing feelings and thoughts, whether it's through a letter or through poetry, however creative, whether it's through a painting, of really just getting those feelings out. But grief is the feeling, but actually grieving is the process of grieving. And if we get stuck in that, that's when we need to reach out for help. Like if we notice that we are having symptoms of deep depression, that's not just effects of the grieving, but we're stuck in that, that's when you need to reach out to a pastor or a professional counselor to really, they can help. They can't make the grief go away, but what they can do is hold your hand and walk you through the journey of grieving.
A good guide.
Yeah, a good guide, exactly. A guide to healing.
Yeah. And there's no shame, even as pastors. I've been a minister for over 7 years now, or coming up on 7 years. And I know how hard it is as a pastor to admit that something is wrong. But you need to, because if you don't go and sit at the throne and you don't seek help, you're going to hurt other people.
Absolutely. And that is a whole unpacking of another conversation that I would like to have you back on to talk about. Is we're not wounded and bleeding on other people and
cross-contamination.
Making other people pay for something that happened to us, but when we're supposed to be in the ministry of reconciliation. So if you are grieving today, friends, acknowledge your pain. Find somebody to walk you through it.
Yeah.
Take good care of yourself. Be patient with yourself. Take some time off and really sit and feel the feelings. Acknowledge that you are in pain and give it to the Lord. He understands our pain. And I just pray for everyone that's watching today that's grieving, that I declare that Psalms 147 over you, that God is in the process of healing your broken heart and binding up your wounds. We thank you for joining us today on Pathway to Healing and Wholeness. As always, if you need to reach out, you can call 988 if you need someone to talk to, and there will be somebody there willing to talk with you and walk you through. You do not have to suffer alone. Until next time, this is Lisa Eady, your host on Pathway to Healing and Wholeness.
The advice on this program is not intended to replace that of psychiatric care. If you or someone you know needs help, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Dial 988 or 1-800-273-8255. You can also go to suicidepreventionlifeline.org.